introduction, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First, an apology. The flight attendant spilled some juice on my real jacket and a fake jacket. It's a delight to be here in Ottawa, only my second time. I spoke here 5 years ago. I'm most grateful to Fred for inviting me, and I have to say it's my first time speaking on behalf of the Film Society. What better film society than this one? I feel I got to know Fred Linden by reading the long biography of him in The Citizen just last night. He looked like him, all sorts of work, so I felt like I was meeting an old friend. It's also a particularly happy day to be speaking here, because as some of you might know, today, Mahmoud Mohammed Isa Mohammed has been deported. 26-year-long odyssey. And I had a very small part in it. In 1994, I did some expert testimony on behalf of the government of Canada. And that round was won by the government of Canada, and made, of course, a virtual difference. It took another 19 years for him to actually be deported. But I think it's due to the government efforts since 2006 to tighten up what had been, in effect, a lack of control over the borders. He was the symbol, the poster boy for that. Brantford is now, and Canada is now, a safer place for that. I mean, not so much safer, really, but more principled. You can't have a terrorist with blood in his hands roaming freely in the streets of Canada. So he is no longer roaming freely. My topic is Islam versus Islamism. There's been a question for some years now, especially in the aftermath of 9/11, but continuing on, as to who is the enemy. What is the nature of this problem symbolized by everything from 9/11 to the attempt on the via trainings a couple weeks ago? And there are basically three answers. One answer, which I call the establishment answer, is that it is radical extremism. It is Al-Qaeda. It is a limited and sort of vague force. The second answer is that it is Islam, the religion of Islam, which is static, essentialist, unchanging. Geert Wilders, the Dutch politician, did a movie in which he showed passages of the Quran and then actions in the last few years which embodied those actions, beheadings or attacks. And the third position, which stands between those two, is that it's a form of Islam, Islamism. Radical Islam, militant Islam, political Islam, totalitarian Islam, extremist Islam, but some form of Islam. Now, while there are three positions, really the first of them about radical extremism is euphemistic, inaccurate, and intellectually deficient position, not worthy of consideration. It's the latter two that are quite interesting, and it's those latter two that I'd like to explore. The real intellectual debate is between those two positions. The Islam position, as opposed to Islamism position, holds that there are basic tenets of Islam, such as jihad, male superiority over females, that are inherent in religion, have never changed, never will change, and that's that. And that you haven't seen it change until now, you won't see it change. I disagree with that position because clearly there has been change. Islam is a religion that has changed over time. Furthermore, there are different kinds of Islam. There are quietist Sufis. There are violent jihadis, and there are many different stripes in between. Over 1,400 years in several continents. One can't simply reduce this massive phenomenon that now includes over 1 billion people to something simple. Muslims are not robotically controlled by the Quran. It's not so simple as that. I'm a historian, and the basic insight of the historian is that things change over time. Just because something was doesn't mean it will be the same. So, first argument against the Islam position is that essentialism is wrong. Things change in human life. That you can't extrapolate from the past to the future. The second argument would be that you can't just look at scriptures. You can't take a document like the Quran and say, aha, this is it. Of course, the Quran is unchanging, but on the one hand, the Quran doesn't define all of Muslim life, and on the other hand, how the Quran is understood changes. So something that was widespread in the past is not necessarily so today. To take one example, there's a phrase in the Quran, "La ikraha fi-d-din," which means there should be no compulsion in religion. If one looks closely at this very simple statement, it's had numerous different interpretations. Everything from the American-style First Amendment to saying it's been abrogated by other verses in the Quran, which in fact do compel religion. So different times, different places, different readings. The meaning of jihad has changed over time. This new phenomenon, for example, in these recent years, the last 20 years or so, something new has developed in jihad. The notion of global jihadis going to Afghanistan, we're going to Bosnia, we're going to Chechnya, we're now going to Syria. Jihadis from around the world going to some such place. Never happened before. It's now something very important. Take something like the place of women. In the Taliban Afghanistan, which was Islamist, girls were not allowed to go to school. Essentially, women were not allowed out of the house. In the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which is similar in spirit in some ways, women have far more. They do go to school, segregated. They do have elevators, segregated. They do have bank tellers, segregated. And then you go to, but they can't drive. In Iran, women have far more opportunities because the reigning ethos in Iran is that it is a safe Muslim environment. Muslim women are free to drive, to engage in business, and so forth. So you have variance within the ethos. Within the Islamist context. Now is, in many ways, the most radical moment in the history of Islam. Things are very different today than 40 years ago, in 1973, and presumably they will be very different 40 years hence, 2050. Put it differently, if things can get worse, as they have in my career, much worse, they can also get better. Islam is a changing phenomenon. Things get worse, things get better. It's something historical. Now I'd like to enter into a bit of professorial mode and talk about how Islam can work. There's something that I dubbed the medieval synthesis. And it goes as follows. The Sharia, Islamic law, is key to the way in which one lives Muslim life. It is both private and public. It has to do with cleanliness, raising children, prayer, sexuality, on the one hand, has to do with business practices and taxation, and going to war, and sovereignty, on the other hand. It's a little bit like the Jewish sacred law, but Jewish sacred law is essentially private. The Sharia is private and public. The Sharia makes many demands on Muslims which are effectively untenable. For example, it prohibits war between Muslims. Well, most Muslims live near each other, and so that's not feasible. In fact, humans go to war with each other. And over the course of time, I would estimate that 3/4 of the war in which Muslims engaged was against fellow Muslims. In recent years, for example, the Iran war. The Sharia demands perpetual jihad against non-Muslims. That's not feasible. You can't be at war all the time. The Sharia only allows for minimal taxation. Yeah, they can sustain that in Saudi Arabia where they have oil revenues, but in a normal state, where the state has to tax its population, it's not enough for a modern state, even a pre-modern state. It demands no interest on money. Well, finances require interest on money. You can't get around it. For example, in the case of adultery, it requires that 4 men of good reputation watch the sexual act in rented electa, and actually see it. How often is that going to happen? The Sharia is in many ways untenable. And so, to get around these and other overambitious demands, pre-modern Muslims developed legalistic figures that allow allowed for the relaxation of Islamic provisions without directly violating them. The jurists came up with games, tricks, and other means by which the letter of the law could be fulfilled while negating its spirit. For example, came up with a mechanism like the Hudna, which allows Muslim states to live not in a state of war with non-Muslims. Developed the notion of a double sale. If I want to buy something from you, you buy it first from me, and then I buy it back from you, and it's a double sale, and in fact, it's, when done properly, it leads to the payment of interest. This compromise is what I call the medieval synthesis. This synthesis translated Islam from a body of abstract and unfeasible demands into a workable system. In practical terms, it toned down the Sharia and made the code of laws operational. The Sharia could now be adequately applied without Muslims subjected to its more practical demands. The synthesis worked over the centuries, but it never overcame its central weakness, which is that it's not rooted in or derived from the text of Islam. It's something that was done on the spur, on the fly, by jurists and by kings and others. These are based on compromises and half measures. They're always vulnerable to challenge by purists who said, no, we must apply the law in its entirety. And so pre-modern Muslim history, that is, say, before 1800, featured many challenges by purists, or what we now call Islamists, who demanded full application of the law. For example, in the 12th century, the Almohads of Morocco and Spain, or in the 18th century, the Mohammedans. Each time, the jurists' efforts eventually subsided, surged, and then they too couldn't apply these laws in their entirety, and the medieval synthesis was reasserted. Now, this de facto solution broke down about 2 centuries ago with the onslaught of modernity, the coming of the Europeans. Europeans showed that they had capabilities far greater than what the Muslims did. When Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798, he came with a modern army, modern savants, modern weaponry, modern